off with Laura. Laura, could you briefly introduce yourself, your background, and your connection to this topic? And then I'd love it if you could tell us a little bit about how the pandemic is magnifying existing inequalities, particularly gender inequality, and what can be done to mitigate it.
Okay, hello everybody. So I'm Laura, I'm a member of Feminist Fight Back, which is an anti-capitalist collective. We're based at the Common House in East London. We've been around for about 12 years, and in that time we have campaigned for reproductive rights, supported cleaners' strikes, opposed nursery cuts, and our current campaign is to try and stop the NHS charges for migrants, particularly around maternity care and abortion. So, I mean, do you want me to kind of keep talking now, Annie, about some of the kind of things that Feminist Fight Back has been highlighting around the effects of the pandemic on women? I should go for it.
Please do.
Yeah. Okay. So since lockdown, Feminist Fight Back's primarily been using our social media to highlight how the pandemic is affecting less visible groups of women workers, especially care workers, sex workers, and cleaners. And so that's what I decided to focus on today. And I hope that's going to complement what the other speakers are bringing in, because obviously there are very varied sort of gendered impacts of the pandemic. I'm going to refer to some campaigns and some emergency funds, and I'm hoping that Another Europe will be able to circulate the details of those to their members. So the two main sex worker-led organisations, the English Collective of Prostitutes and Swarm, have pointed out that sex workers are now almost completely unable to make a living as the industry has ground to a halt. Sex work is a semi-criminalised industry, and many sex workers have uncertain immigration status. And so it's therefore impossible for them to do the kinds of things that more official workers are doing right now, being furloughed or accessing government support for self-employed people. And so sex worker organisations have created emergency funds to help their members in severe financial hardship. NHS care workers and cleaners, unlike most doctors and nurses, are often outsourced, and many of them do not get proper sick pay. Instead, they're expected to survive on £96 a week statutory sick pay, putting huge financial pressure on them to come into work anyway, thus compounding the public health crisis and putting their own lives in danger. Many of these workers are BME, and these are the kinds of economic conditions that are contributing to the horrifying fact that the COVID virus seems to be killing disproportionately more Black and brown people. Unions such as the IWGB, United Voices of the World, and the Safe and Equal campaign have all been working hard to address these injustices. Cleaners in private houses, in just people's houses, have actually received hardly any media attention and much less union support. And this is despite the fact that 1 in 10 UK households now employ cleaners. And also, since the lockdown, most of these households have just laid off their cleaners without continuing to pay them. Private cleaning is also a very informal industry. Many cleaners don't earn anywhere near enough to pay tax, and so don't declare their earnings. And this means that they are now completely ineligible to apply not only for the government self-employed scheme, but also for statutory sick pay. Live-in domestic workers, e.g. nannies and full-time cleaners, are in an even worse situation, often losing their housing in addition to their wages. Many of them are migrant workers whose visa status depends upon continuing employment with a particular family. And so the NGO Voices of Domestic Workers has also had to create an emergency fund for many of its members who have been made completely destitute as a result of just being summarily fired in response to the pandemic. Now, some people are saying, oh, well, why don't cleaners just go out and get another cleaning job in a hospital that needs them? But household cleaning is mainly done by mothers with young children, precisely because it can be fitted around childcare. And cleaners, whether they work in private homes or in public institutions, have not been included in the government's list of key workers, which means that their children are not eligible for childcare in schools. So why have these apparently quite different types of workers, sex workers, care workers, cleaners, all been particularly badly affected by the pandemic and been ignored or fallen through the government's safety nets? So the answer for me is obvious, that it's largely due to the fact that all these are industries employing mainly women, doing a type of work that is usually seen as women's work, even when people of other genders are doing it. In our society, women are expected to clean, care, and provide sexual services for free. And this is just seen as a natural expression of femininity rather than as a form of work. When this work is done in return for a wage, this idea that this isn't really proper work means that employers, whether they're the owners of large businesses or an individual who employs a cleaner or a childminder, are often resentful about paying for it. And there's a circular logic here, whereby the low pay and low status of this work means that it continues to be mainly done by women, especially migrant and BME women, who have few other options. Historically, and maybe I should have said I work as a historian at the University of Warwick, and I research the history of domestic workers. So historically, trade unions and leftists have also failed to recognise domestic workers and sex workers as proper workers, tending to focus on white male factory workers. And these women workers have been left out of labour laws designed to protect wages and conditions. So the panic is therefore highlighting and compounding a much longer standing problem: the invisibility and marginalisation of women's reproductive labour. So it seems completely bizarre to me that the government has not included cleaners in its list of key workers, given the absolutely crucial role that cleaners, especially on public transport and in hospitals, are playing in fighting this virus. But I think that denying cleaners key worker status is actually just a very clear example of the way in which cleaning is ignored and devalued every day in every aspect of our society. So if we're trying to work to think about what possibilities this horrible pandemic situation might be throwing up for us, one possible silver lining, if it's acceptable to use that phrase, is that maybe it is making much clearer exactly whose work is really essential work to keep society going. We're all dependent upon people supplying and cooking food, cleaning hospitals and public transport, looking after children and sick people. And I'm hoping that this exceptional historical moment will be an opportunity to get that message out loud and clear. And to do so not just to offer platitudes, to say thank you and how grateful we are, but also to demand a massive increase in wages for all those people doing these jobs. The pandemic has also meant that people, usually men, who would normally get someone else, usually women, to do their housework, cooking and childcare for them, are suddenly having to experience what it's like to do that work for themselves. And so I hope that this sudden realization that this is indeed skilled, difficult and tiring work will generate a greater respect for the people who do it day in, day out. But I would also like us to use this moment to try and rethink even more fundamentally how work is shared out in our society and how it is organised. Do we really want to live in a world where some people spend all day looking after children and other people spend all day staring at a computer screen? Wouldn't it be better if all of us had more time to do our own cooking, cleaning and caring, and all of us had the opportunity to do other types of work alongside it. So I'm looking forward to hearing what other people think about this, and I hope that maybe this meeting is an opportunity not just to identify the many problems that are happening right now, but also to think together about solutions. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Shaista, let's turn to you. If you could briefly introduce yourself and maybe talk a little bit about your work and how the virus is impacting violence against women and girls, and through what lens we should be responding to the virus.
Right, I'm going to mute myself. Hi everyone, it's really good to be on this call, and thank you to Another Europe is Possible for organising this space. It's really critical that we have more of these type of spaces to talk about these issues and to basically galvanise solidarity and action. So my name is Shaista Aziz. I'm a journalist. I've also spent the past almost 20 years working as an international aid worker. So I have a lot of experience of working with particularly women and girls around the world in countries impacted by conflict, so-called natural disasters, and everything else in between. So the last place I worked in was Northeast Nigeria, where I was working with women and girls impacted by the extreme violence of Boko Haram and the Nigerian military. So that's basically my background, but I'm also a city councillor in Oxford, which is where I'm joining you from today. And I'm also an intersectional feminist, proud to be one. And I do a lot of work with women in particular experiencing homelessness. So I want to start this, my contribution to this discussion by looking at the global picture. And just to start by saying the COVID-19 pandemic is really shining a very, very ugly light on massive issues that have never really been dealt with. The inequalities, the huge levels of inequalities around the world, especially in the Western world, are really out there now for everyone to see. And these inequalities are absolutely 100% rooted in patriarchy, they're rooted in white supremacy, they're rooted in racism, they're rooted in class discrimination, and they're rooted in gender discrimination. Now, globally around the world, since this pandemic started and since the global lockdown has started, the United Nations Population Fund says that there are likely to be 15 million more cases of domestic violence around the world. That's just since this lockdown started. Johns Hopkins University and Victoria University in Australia say that out of the 193 UN member states, there's expected to be a 20% rise in domestic abuse and violence, and up to 144 million women in low and middle income households and countries are going to be impacted by this violence. We're also seeing a massive rise in terms of the rights of women being rolled back in terms of their contraceptive rights, their reproductive rights. And this is not new. This has been going on for a very, very long time. But in the past 5 years in particular, all of this has been accelerated. And one of the reasons for this is that politically, the rolling back of women's rights has become very, very mainstream. Once upon a time, it was women who look like me, visible Muslim women who other feminists were kind of busy trying to save. We were encouraged to write letters and launch human rights campaigns without actually really looking at how patriarchy is a very universal oppressive system that impacts all women. The International Planned Parenthood Federation is saying that around the world, 5,000 of their clinics have been closed. And they are saying that there's likely to be 3 million additional unintended pregnancies and 2.7 million unsafe abortions. So just to be very, very clear, what we're facing is not only a COVID-19 pandemic, but a global pandemic that is violence against women and girls. But this is not new. This has been going on for decades and decades. But right now, we are facing a very, very critical emergency. And just to give you a little bit more context, here in the UK, the National Domestic Abuse Hotline says that they have received a 49% rise in numbers of reported domestic violence cases. And I use the term domestic violence on purpose because we know that domestic abuse is very much part of this framework as well. But I think we should be very clear and call this what it is and call it violence. At the same time, 1.6 million women are really very much facing this emergency. And when we talk about women as intersectional feminists, we need to break down, as Laura has, who are the women who are being most impacted, who are the people who are being most impacted, and patriarchy does not impact women, men, and non-binary people in the same way. We have to be very clear about this. And one of the things that is really urgently missing in our global analysis is race. So there seems to be this really big problem when it comes to the word race. Very few people want to use the word racism. It's a word that really triggers and scares people, particularly policymakers and particularly governments around the world. And if we look at what's happening in the United States of America, if we look at what's happening in the UK, these are two of the richest countries in the world with the highest rates of COVID-19 deaths. And we know those deaths are just scratching the surface because of the way that they're being recorded. It's not accurate. But we're seeing that disproportionate numbers of Black people in America are being impacted by this disease. And it's not just the disease that's impacting them, it's the massive levels of inequalities that have never, ever been challenged. And the same thing is happening in the UK. People from the Afro-Caribbean community are being hardest hit by COVID-19 in relation to the numbers of deaths we're seeing when we break down who is being impacted. And we're also, then the second highest number of people are Asian people, British Asian people. And today there's been a report in The Guardian that's looking at inequalities across this country, across the United Kingdom. And for the last number of years, there's been this narrative that's been built in this country, which is about the metropolitan elite. But if you look at London, which is constantly described as being the epicenter of the metropolitan elite, what we're seeing is absolutely devastating. We're seeing communities and parts of London where you've got the highest number of people from different communities living together. That's where this disease is hitting hardest. And so I feel very strongly as an intersectional feminist that what we need to start doing is looking at all our public policy through the eyes of intersectionality. We need to look at our housing policy, we need to look at our health policy, we need to look at how public space, who is public space available for. And we know that always public space is restricted, especially for women and girls around the world, but also non-binary people and trans people as well, whose rights are being heavily rowed back. So we can see what the problems are, but when I say that, actually, I believe that a lot of people want to deny these problems as well. And I think on the left in particular, there is a reluctance to discuss intersectionality because there's an attempt to suggest that by looking at intersectionality, what we're actually further doing is dividing people rather than fighting as workers or uniting under one banner. And I actually think this is avoiding looking at the truth. We cannot go around believing that intersectionality is about division. It's not. Intersectionality is about justice. Intersectionality is about rooting our solidarities, our campaigning, our politics in the politics of oppression and understanding how oppression functions day to day and why it impacts particular people and particular groups. The Women Inequalities Committee, whatever one makes of them, have asked for a submission from people to look at the impact of COVID-19 on the protected groups of protected characteristics. And I actually submitted some evidence to this group. And I just want to go through a few of these things just in the remaining time I have. So one of the biggest groups of people, in particular women and non-binary people being impacted by COVID-19 are people with disabilities. Here in the UK, this government has been condemned consistently by the United Nations for its treatment of people with disabilities. But as Laura's already said, the burden of care falls heavily on the shoulders of women around the world. It doesn't matter how rich or how poor a country is, that is a universal fact. And what we're seeing is during this lockdown, we're seeing an increased isolation of women with disabilities. 1 in 5 women are disabled, which means women are more impacted by isolation. And this definitely increases for women who are disabled and have intersectional identities. We also know that women overwhelmingly, as I said, are the people providing the care. I recently spoke to a woman who has a son who's autistic, and she actually contacted me at 3 o'clock in the morning. She contacted me at 3 a.m. to tell me that she was panicked and she was sitting outside her house because she simply can't cope with her son, who is autistic, because his care worker is no longer available to him. He no longer has a routine. He's unable to go to school. And what she basically said to me was that her son's behavior towards her, which is not how he usually is towards her, but this is because of this pandemic and the impact it's having on his well-being. She said that his behavior is triggering for her, and it's reminding her of her ex-husband who subjected her to extreme levels of abuse, physical, mental and sexual abuse, which then meant that she ended up living on the streets. We also need to understand that when it comes to homelessness here, not only here in the UK, but around the world, one of the biggest drivers of homelessness, particularly street homelessness, is domestic abuse, domestic violence and sexual abuse. So this woman told me that her son's behavior towards her was triggering all of this, and she ended up sitting outside her house at 3 a.m. because she said it was the safest space for her to be in, and because she needed to clear her head. So this is just one woman's reality. The other issues that we need to be aware of is for people, particularly women with mental health issues. Prescription drugs are not easily available anymore. Access to GPs are being restricted. Also, access to food. This is a massive, massive issue. We know that hunger and food poverty is really deepening in this country in particular, as it is in other parts of the world. And we know that women in particular around the world usually get less nutrition than men and boys in particular, and this is because of how access to food is very much gendered, it's very patriarchal. There's high levels of deprivation in very rich cities. Here in Oxford, this is a very, very rich city. We have some of the highest rates of deprivation in the UK. So I'm just going to skip over some of this and just, so the other things that we need to be aware of is the lack of queer sensitivity in the healthcare system. Transphobia and homophobia is rife everywhere, but these systems are not built to be able to cater for the needs of people in relation to their gender and their sexuality. There are no safe spaces really for trans people to flee safely. Again, we're seeing large numbers of gay people, members of the LGBTQI community, particularly young people, ending up on the streets because there is nowhere for them to go. And right now, they are under isolation and under lockdown. And for many of them, their very identity is why they're at risk. And then we're seeing, as I already said, domestic violence cases are rocketing. There's an organisation called Counting Dead Women. They say that there's been 16 murders here in the United Kingdom since this lockdown started. We're seeing that no recourse to public funds, so women who have insecure immigration status, they are very much at the front line of this gendered violence and gendered abuse, which is related to COVID-19. And the hostile environment in this country is absolutely putting women's lives at further risk because of this. Honour-based violence, I know Hera has a lot of experience of working on honour-based violence. The system simply is not able to really understand women and non-binary people who have different levels of risk attached to them because of their multiple identities. So I think I'm just going to finish off by saying that in terms of what we need to do next, we need to urgently build an intersectional analysis of what's going on. We need to make sure this analysis is very much embedded into our health system. We hear that the government wants to launch an inquiry looking into why there's been disproportionate numbers of deaths in terms of the way COVID-19 is impacting communities of colour in this country. But we have to go beyond that. We have to look at the intersections of class, of disability, of sexuality and of gender. And this is missing everywhere. And the other thing we need to do is, as the left, we need to really understand that intersectionality is not about division. It's about, as I said, really understanding the root causes of oppression. And if we say that we want to build this solidarity and we want to make this change, then we have to first of all understand the problem for what it is. And then we need to make sure that we are advocating alongside the people impacted by this crisis. But this is a global crisis, and we're not going to come out of this anytime soon. As a women's rights campaigner, I know from talking to lots of women and lots of women's rights organizations that actually the floodgates will very much open when the lockdowns are lifted. That's when we will see really the true magnitude of what is going on in people's homes. Now, the funding is simply not there. The money that's being put forward by the government is completely inadequate, and it has been for decades. And austerity in particular has compounded all of this crisis. And so what we're seeing now is a fallout of that. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Shaista, for highlighting the intersectional lens through which we should be responding to this crisis, and particularly pointing out that certain groups are hardest hit. I really appreciated that story of the mother who was having to deal with her autistic child. Hera, let's turn to you. In these times of isolation, how can technology and platforms like CHAYN be used to reach women at risk? And what best practices can we be turning to right now?
Thank you very much. I think this is a great time for me to talk because, you've already heard about some of the issues that we are facing as a society, as a global community. So I'm going to focus on the bright lights and things that are working or things that could work. My background is, I grew up in Pakistan. I came to the UK for university, and then always wanted to do something in technology. So I got involved in tech startups at university in Glasgow. And from there, I got into social entrepreneurship, was really interested in the intersection of like good business and technology. And while doing this, helped a migrant friend of mine get out of an abusive marriage, and was really shocked how hard it was to get help in both UK and my home in Pakistan. So it felt like the sector was really geared towards someone walking to the police station, calling the police, or calling like a helpline within certain hours. And all those restrictions were made it really hard for my friend to get help. So that led me to start my own nonprofit called CHAYN, and it's been going for 7 years. So I will talk a little bit about that, but first I wanted to tell you about some of the things that Shaista touched on around domestic abuse. We've heard a lot about it. In fact, just in the UK, the search, like if you look at Google Trends, the search for domestic abuse UK has gone up by 250%. And, when you're a survivor, most likely you're not going on Google and searching domestic abuse UK. So you're searching things like, what can I do? Or how do I get a divorce? These are the kind of things that you search for. So my focus has very much been on the neglected part of the gender-based violence spectrum, which is all those young people who go online and look for help and don't pick up the phone, or all those migrant women who feel because of their undocumented status or their unsure status and no recourse to public funds, they might feel like, well, they don't want to talk to someone because it feels like that's a very big step, like picking up the phone, because then someone has your voice, someone has your details, they can find your location, all of those fears. So I'll tell you a little bit about what I've seen that's been good. One of the things that I think about when we talk about domestic abuse, and I do use the word domestic abuse rather than domestic violence, and the reason for that is that if you think about gender-based violence as a space, domestic abuse is probably the most prevalent form of it. 1 in 3 women, face gender-based violence across the world. It's the same in Europe. And within that, in the UK, 1 in 4 face domestic abuse. The reason why I use the word domestic abuse is, and I think it's important for this discussion, because so much of the coverage has been on the side of the scale where people are dying, and that is a real concern. But there are so many more people who live with that abuse every day and will not die, but no one talks about them. So it's about those who live with that persistent in different forms of abuse. So I think we have to reframe this idea of a battered woman, cowering before a man's like punch, that all those kind of imagery that you see. A lot of survivors don't identify that they are going through abuse because their situation doesn't look like that. So when I talk about domestic abuse, I'm talking about people who, the language that CHAYN uses has been very much like, are you in a toxic relationship? Do you feel worse about yourself, after entering a relationship? Do you not have access to your finances? Are you told not to talk to certain people? Does your partner keep hold of all your passwords? So all these things get exasperated because, if you think about, and if you put domestic abuse to the side for a second, stalking, this is a nightmare for stalkers, people who are being stalked, because they are stuck in one place. So if someone knows where you live, then you're basically sitting duck. Or people who live in intergenerational homes. We've seen that in Italy. CHAYN has a chapter in Italy. They've seen that as well. And not everywhere the number of calls to helplines are increasing. In Italy, it has decreased. And it's not because domestic abuse hasn't exasperated. It's because people are too afraid to call. It is such a thing, because when you call someone can overhear you. And just the thought of that. And in Italy, there's like no live chat facilities. It's really hard to get in touch online. So CHAYN Italia is trying to offer that support. So it's a complementary support. So my work has really focused on how do we complement the amazing groundwork that happens with online options for people for whom it is not possible to do all the things that you could do offline. Because I think a lot of us have this assumption that if you're really facing some difficulty, you'd really want to pick up the phone or go somewhere right away. We have this very hero image of helping someone escape from domestic abuse. And actually that is not how it works. Research from Women's Aid a few years ago said that more than 50 incidents would happen of violent episodes before someone calls the police. So it's about how we create public policy, public awareness, and how we use language that allows people throughout those 50 incidents to both look for the red flags, identify them, and for us to be there for them. So some good examples, and I'll give you some not bad examples, but things that I'm not sure of. So good examples that we've seen from France, really practical, making hotel rooms that are vacant available for survivors of domestic abuse and sexual assault who may have kids and need a place to go. In the UK, over the last 5 years, the funding for shelters has been halved by, not even halved, has been cut by 1/3, and especially for BME specific shelters, it's even less. They're getting less funding. So the communities that really need specialist support don't have it. So why can't other countries in Europe do the same? It's a really simple thing. In South Africa, police are working with women's organizations to help people physically relocate, because that's where the danger is. And obviously because of lockdowns, it's even harder. Both in the UK and Pakistan, we've seen that there's been an increase in neighbors calling to report, because they can hear things. And things that I think are happening, but I'm not sure how effective those are there's a really good UK government campaign at the moment called You Are Not Alone, and other countries are doing the same, which I think is really good, because it means that we are showing solidarity with people who are in those abusive situations. But what I don't think is as helpful, but because I've not seen any impact metrics of it, is things like you go to a pharmacy or you call the phone, you call someone and you say a particular word. A lot of these initiatives come, and I've never seen any impact study of how effective they are. And it really has to be personalized to each person. So what is CHAYN doing? My organization, it's a volunteer-led group, and we have about 400 volunteers from 20 countries, and we work globally. And we've been doing a lot of work in the UK recently, especially since COVID-19 happened. We have a lot of resources online. So the way we use tech is we put the kind of information women are searching for on Google online and help direct them to offline services, which, is something so simple you would think it exists, but it doesn't. So that's the thing that we do. However, since, because it's only volunteer-led, we can't offer things like live chat, which Women's Aid in the UK is offering, and a lot of the charities in other European countries are doing as well. What we found was that what was missing was that people don't have that consistent support, a long-term support. When we talk about interventions, we often talk about interventions at the last stage. Someone's ready to leave. How do you get someone to that stage? How do you support someone? And some people may never leave, and there might be lots of reasons for it. So how do you support those people? So since we had our views on like our website, like chayn.co, went up by 3 times since the lockdown started. And this was before like the UK government was linking to it. So I knew it was going to increase. So our volunteers and us, we spent, I think we took 5 days to launch a whole new program. And it's like a trauma support group on Telegram, which is a secure app like WhatsApp. And the idea is that you offer people like resilience building skills and trauma support, because these are the people who, when you say, 16 women have died, which is a really important thing to recognize, and the fact that there might be a lot more. There's a study that's looking into 25, that number that could be 25. It's about all the hundreds and thousands of people who think, well, I've never been, my abuse has never reached that level. So maybe I'm like, my situation isn't as bad yet, but there is no guarantee when that moment hits. So it's about how do you support people along that stage. And our trauma resilience group has had 80 people join. And it's just one example of how we've used free technology to just support people in a different way. And it's not to take away from the shelters. It's not to take away from all the groundwork and campaigning that happens, but it's just thinking about the tools that we have in supporting people. And it also shows us that the domestic abuse sector was not prepared for this. In fact, the whole gender violence space was not prepared for it. Europe's been caught off guard. So many organizations are reaching out to me saying, well, how do you do this stuff? And I've been campaigning about this for 7 years, telling charities to create online, work streams. Of course, they're working under immense pressure and there's definitely not enough funding. So I'll just end on 2 notes of happiness, which is from the UK, because I know there are things there's so much stuff the government needs to do. And I've been talking about it, but all the things that could help, including making more resources available to migrant women and lifting the no recourse to public funds. But one good thing that I spotted, which gave me hope, was that there's at least public policy is being reactive. So the UK government announced that they were going to give £2 million to helplines and online support. Never before have I ever seen the word online support being mentioned in government funding when it comes to domestic abuse. That recognition, even if it's a small sum, for me is I'll see that as a sign of hope, that they're recognizing, yes, all those people who are searching online for help and get nothing, they deserve something. And the fact that recently we've heard that from the 750 million that the Chancellor announced for the charity sector in general, quite a significant portion will go to the violence against women sector. So these are 2 hopeful notes to end on.
That's great. Thank you so much. And thank you also for raising the broad definition that we should be taking of domestic abuse and the various forms that it can take. Because I think we want this to be more of an interactive conversation, we would like to open it up to the audience for questions. And in the meantime, I would actually love to ask a question, selfishly, of the panelists. I think as a journalist, I'm always interested in learning from people who are working on the front lines and interacting with the people hardest hit from public policy decisions. I'm interested in knowing what you think the media hasn't gotten right or hasn't reported on. What should we know as the left? That's for anyone who chooses to respond.
Well, for me, I can start by saying that I think that we need to be so inclusive in the way we talk about women's issues. So whether it be in access to reproductive rights, to things like domestic abuse or stalking or sexual assault, I think we focus so much on the sensationalization of it. There's all those times that I've reached out to journalists saying, this is a big problem, can you cover this? And then no one covers it until they see deaths on on the news. And it's just really sad that we can't talk about structural inequalities unless there are dead bodies around us.
Yeah, so I'm a journalist myself, and I find it incredibly frustrating how so many of these issues are framed, and the fact that the stark inequality in this country is coming as a surprise and as a shock to so many people is a failure of journalists. It's a failure of many other institutions too, but definitely journalism. It's really impossible to close your eyes to the levels of staggering levels of poverty in this country, the record levels of street homelessness and other forms of homelessness. It should not come as a surprise that people, nurses, NHS nurses are, working full time and then having to go to the food bank at the end of the month. And I think part of the problem around this is that there's an attempt to whitewash and depoliticize poverty, patriarchy, white supremacy and racism. And this has been going on for a very, very long time, which is why it's really, really important that we, on the left in particular, we inject intersectionality into our analysis and into our solidarity work. And we also inject human rights and put it right at the core of our quest for changing things. But I think also the way minorities are pitted up against each other constantly by the media as well is disgraceful. And when it comes to minorities, we're always seen as being separate of the rest of the country and the rest of the population. There is no attempt to ever provide any context that is actually genuine and real. So the final point I'll make on this is when it comes to, we're seeing the disproportionate numbers of Black people and ethnic minority people who are dying, not just in this country, but around the world, in the Western world from COVID-19. There is no sort of desire to kind of root this in poverty, to root it in inequity, and root it in the politics of austerity. We've had more than 10 years of austerity in this country, but this word is never mentioned when it comes to the actual coverage of COVID-19. Austerity is simply missing. Instead, what we're hearing is these like football style chants from the government about, we're all in this together. And, the very fact that the Prime Minister Boris Johnson became sick with COVID-19, it was being suggested by journalists that, he would now have a better understanding of what it means for people who are also suffering from COVID-19. Why would he have a better understanding? What reality does Boris Johnson live day to day that the people right at the bottom of the heap live? It's just absolutely ridiculous. And this is deliberately being done. It's like the whitewashing of the political reality for people and the political violence that has been inflicted on the most marginalized and the most poorest people in this country and in Europe.
I've been hiding from the news quite a lot in the last 6 weeks, so I don't have a sort of coherent overview, but I guess one of the things that I've been interested in is how it seems that the press has actually had to catch up with what the public are discussing on a number of issues. So one of the first thoughts that I had when the lockdown happened was about what is happening to women in abusive relationships. And so I had a look. I was like, right, where's the articles on this? Where's the statistics? Nothing. We then decided to try and sort of discuss it on Facebook. And then it was interesting to see over the next few weeks a number of articles to come out. Similarly for what was happening to sex workers. It was Swarm who raised this issue very early on, and then kind of 4 weeks later, The Guardian finally published an article about it. I guess I'm also interested in what is sort of too embarrassing to talk about during this pandemic. And I think probably the journalists often didn't have the language to talk about sex workers as workers, people who need to earn money and are using this as a way to earn money. And therefore they were kind of, the sort of economic impact of the pandemic on the sex industry as one of the many industries that has ground to a halt was something that they didn't really kind of have the language to talk about for a while. So, I guess one of the hopeful things is that maybe activists have been pushing discussions into the media, and that journalists are kind of, catching up with that.
Yeah, sorry, Annie, one other thing I just wanted to sort of add as well is the other thing is the absolute erasure of working class people, politically and in terms of journalistically as well. So we don't really see working class people, we don't really hear from working class people on our radios or our televisions unless there's a working class issue. That's when working class people pop up. And in the last 10 years of austerity in this country, we've seen a flurry of so-called reality TV programs programs, Benefit Street, other types of programs where celebrities arrive in a poor person's house and learn how to cook a meal for their children with like £1. It's like, well, why is this industry popping up? This industry is popping up because there's simply this, there's a political deafness when it comes to just actually believing people, believing that they have nothing, believing that they have reached rock bottom, believing that they can't continue with their lives the way they are. And this very much is how working class people are treated. And then when working class people are given access to the media to tell their stories, it kind of is framed about pitting one person against another. So pitting a worker against a migrant worker, pitting, a woman of color against a trans person. This is kind of the framing. And this is very much the framing of our political system as well. So, if I have something, it's because you don't have it. And if you have something, then I can't have it. This is just absurd. And I feel that the other issue that we need to raise as well is the fact that there is a fundamental lack of diversity in journalism, full stop. It's one of the most elite professions in the world. It continues to be, especially in this country. Most journalists are privately educated. They come from very elite backgrounds. And, the ones who don't are gig economy workers, they're freelancers, and now they're finding that they don't have any money to live off, and some of them are finding it very hard to even be able to access any of the government schemes when it comes to trying to get some money. So I think all of these issues, which have constantly been exposed, for want of a better word, but they are coming further, they're further adding to the way this pandemic is being framed by the mainstream media. It's not being framed rooted in the oppressions, the systems of oppression, which then leads us to understand why certain groups and people are being the hardest hit.
Absolutely, I could not agree more. So I'm curious to know from any of you who, I guess, what exactly, a few of you have mentioned in connection with other sort of industries like sex work, home care work, how migrant and refugee women are particularly impacted by the virus and what we should know about their situation. Maybe we can start with you, Shaista.
Okay, I thought I may be speaking a bit too much on this little panel already, but well, the first thing is they've been made further invisible, right? So if the state's policy is the state has said the policy is to make illegal immigrants and migrants' life as difficult as possible, and then that's exactly what the state has done. So women are being made invisible. They are being put further at harm in terms of the global domestic abuse pandemic and the pandemic that we're seeing in this country. I'll just give you a quick example. Over the last 2 months, I've been working with a woman who is pregnant. She's a migrant woman. She has no recourse to public funds. She contacted me. She ended up being able to access hospital treatment because of her pregnancy. The family that her estranged husband's family were not even allowing her to go to hospital, but she managed to get to hospital. The sequence of events are that she contacted her mother in Pakistan. She picked up a phone, she rang her mother in Pakistan and said, I need to leave this house. If I don't leave this house, I'm going to die. That's how the alert was first raised, okay? She ended up getting access to a hospital. There, the violent behavior ended up coming into the hospital because of the estranged in-laws, etc., etc. Anyway, to cut a very long story short, there are 3 police forces in this country investigating her claims of honour-based violence, investigating her claims of domestic violence. But amongst those 3 police forces, the woman happens to be a migrant with no recourse to public funds, just slipped through the system. There were no safeguarding alerts. There was nothing. That the things that the systems that are supposed to kick in simply didn't kick in. And it was really, I will use the word shocking. Not much shocks me, but I found it shocking and chilling that in the middle of this pandemic, a woman has just disappeared and no one seems to want to know where she is. And the only people involved in the system who actually worked overtime to find out where she was were the midwives. Okay, they were the ones like, where is this woman? Where has she disappeared to? Why has she not appeared on our system? They were the ones who then alerted the other authorities to get her the help that she needed. And I know that she's not the only woman. I know there are many others. Now, I've also been working with another woman who is very young, and she feels that she will be removed from this country, not of her own free will, as soon as the lockdown is lifted. Now, she's not willing to call the police or call anybody, for that matter, for help, because she says that she has nowhere to go. Now, women and people who are being subjected to domestic violence and abuse, they're not stupid. They know that there is nowhere for them to go. They know that the refuges are limited. They know that if you happen to be a trans woman, or if you happen to be gay, or if you happen to be a migrant woman, the chances of you accessing a shelter or a place of safety diminish even further. So basically, every day they're kind of doing this mental arithmetic. They're trying to work out you know, what percentage of them can stay safe and what percentage of them can start really trying to make inroads in terms of thinking about, you know, where they can go for safety. And one of the key reasons why we need an intersectional response to this is because if the entire system is erasing people who are deemed other, it means they simply don't understand their realities and they're unable to provide them with the care and the support that they need. And it's only when you find strong advocates to step in and to start making the noise that's needed that people start getting the help they need. Otherwise, they don't get the help that they need. There's just this constant kind of going back to saying, well, we have a system and we've tried to help or tried to, you know, assist X, Y, or Z. Well, the systems are broken, so they haven't been assisting people on a good day. And in a global pandemic, there are very few good days. So I think these are the real challenges. But on the migrant women specifically, the women's sector as well has not done enough. It absolutely has not done enough to root the realities of migrant women and the racist, hostile environment into its day-to-day work. So I feel that, Hera, I absolutely agree with you when you say that this came as a surprise to many, but it shouldn't have come as a surprise. And one of the reasons why it's come as a surprise is because the NGO sector, for want of a better word, has been depoliticized by the government. There are laws and rules that have been put in place around the lobbying and around the way they campaign. And you cannot campaign around violence against women and girls by depoliticizing it. By its very nature, violence against women and girls is highly, highly political. Patriarchy is political. Oppression is political. So by erasing the politics, you're creating a space that is not fit for purpose and is not fit to be able to actually, you know, work with the most marginalized people. And that's being done deliberately.
Hera, Laura, do you have anything you wanted to add?
I guess maybe I'd just like to use this as an opportunity to kind of highlight one of the ongoing massive problems that this situation has made much worse, which is basically free healthcare being withdrawn to a section of the British population, groups of migrants with uncertain immigration status, basically. And so, as I said at the beginning, this is something that Feminists Fight Back alongside Docs Not Cops and MedAct and Doctors of the World has been campaigning around for a while. Interestingly, when the lockdown started, or rather when the pandemic started, the government very quietly released some information that said, oh, by the way, treatment for COVID-19 is not a chargeable treatment, so anybody can access that treatment. Now, why are they doing that? Because obviously, if you deny people healthcare, it creates massive public health problems. But they made sure that they kind of announced that quietly, partly because I think still quite a lot of people don't know about these NHS charges. So damage has been done, however, because probably many of you will have seen quite widespread reporting now of how many migrants are too scared to go to the hospital to access treatment for COVID, despite the fact that actually they are allowed to and that treatment is free. The hostile environment has been very effective. It's done a very good job. It's made people too frightened to go and try and get essential healthcare. And I'm against these charges because I think healthcare is a human right that should be available to everybody. But these charges also affect all of us, whether or not we're migrants, because of course, what better shows us that we are all interconnected but a contagious disease? And if we don't look after the health of everybody, then the health of all of us is at risk. So I guess I just wanted to use this as an opportunity to kind of carry on raising awareness about these really, you know, the fact that the hostile environment is murderous in a very literal sense.
Yeah, thank you so much for contributing that. It seems we have a question from the audience, so we'll give a minute to hear from that person.
Hello, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I just have a question to the panel. It's very insightful, your talks. Thank you very much. It's some point of concern really with these working from home, you know, way of working, and how it has been probably overlooked, not very considered very well by employers. The situation of single parents, single mothers, and there is another complication about the homeschooling issues and the demands from work for women who has not been benefit from the furlough or has been in a position that they could not stop working, and how they could juggle these situations to adapt. And it's been causing much stress, and mental health could be one of the complications as well. In addition to that, obviously we are in a month of Ramadan with the women of faith having been also employers have not adapted times for meetings online when they've been facing about 17 hours of fasting. So I would like to have this insight from the panel to see what would be the best advice. How can we advocate with employers and HR to consider these more carefully and adapt in a fair way for single mothers? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Should we start with you, Hera?
Yeah, I've been working from home for the past 3 years because I have a day job. I do CHAYN in my spare time, and even for CHAYN, we have a global team, so we've been working remotely. And for me, it's fascinating to see how everyone's just discovering working from home, and you know, they're just going over that curve. There are so many productive ways of doing this. There are like lots of successful organizations that have done this for many years. And I'm really curious why people aren't learning from them, actually using that insight. There's like, you know, I think there's lots of amazing tools out there that can help us like manage time and take better ways of taking care of ourselves, but also work. The thing that I think is interesting is talk about boundaries. And I think that's what a lot of people don't talk about, because when you work from home, oftentimes your work and home boundaries are, you know, especially right now because you have kids at home, you know, and you might be looking after your parents, and like lots of issues that are like interchanging. And what I found curious is that even in organizations that are used to working from home, they haven't adjusted expectations in working through this time. And I think that's what's critical. Working from home can be a great way, especially for like lots of like parents, if they can manage their schedule around other things, because you know, they don't have to pay for childcare and all that. Of course, given if they have caring duties, that's completely different. But I'm just really curious how, when we talk about working from home, we don't talk about like, how do we learn from people who've done it, and secondly, adjust expectations. Employers need to adjust expectations from both the collective anxiety that we're all facing and the added responsibility, especially if you're a woman. Now you have to look after the kids, you have to cook, you have to take care, take the emotional burden of the whole family as well, especially if you have a family, and all of that. And the second thing is, we're also not talking about that boundaries, like, you know, there is harassment that happens at work, which can now happen online. There are lots of incidents of how employers have been, you know, dressed inappropriately or have been making inappropriate, like, you know, comments on people's like living spaces. And like Shaista was saying, like, you know, we put people into boxes, and like when we talk on this box that we're talking in, it's even easier to put people into further smaller boxes, and forget that actually there's like, you know, it not only takes a village to raise a child, you know, we all live in these like tiny villages. So everything we do is affected by that. So I think for me, it's like, it's about flexibility, learning from people who've done it, and boundaries, and reinforcing those boundaries.
Great, thank you. Laura or Shaista, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think, again, what this is showing, despite the government rhetoric about COVID-19 being a leveler, of course, it is not a leveler. And I think what this is really further showing is the need for intersectional feminism. So if you are a woman who has privilege and lives in a big house with a nice garden and has a large disposable income, perhaps it might be for the first time in your life that you're understanding how the migrant woman who is your cleaner, how much your lifestyle and your ability to have that disposable income and your ability to be so privileged very much depends on her and the labor that she provides for you. A lot, the same goes for, you know, au pairs, who mostly are women, obviously not all, but mostly, childminders, everyone else. And I think this is a moment potentially where this solidarity can be deepened and can be created, and it has to be, actually, this has to be the moment, otherwise it will never happen. But I think when it comes to single mothers in particular, society heaps massive amounts of judgment on single mothers. There is one narrative around single mothers generally in this country is a very negative one. And, you know, I've lost count on the number of women I know in my life who've contacted me just to literally scream and cry down the phone saying they can't cope with schooling the children at home. They can't cope with being stuck inside 24 hours a day with their children, and they can't cope not knowing where they're going to find the money to put the food on the table. So these are very much the absolute realities that are impacting women. But again, these realities have been impacting them way before COVID-19 came along. But I just think that there's been this real inability to kind of show solidarity amongst women as well. There are many judgments that women heap on women. And I think that we have to start getting far more real in understanding each other's lives and understanding how all our lives connect. In terms of the mental health issue, this is absolutely key to all of this. So this country is one of the highest levels of mental health issues amongst our young people. Self-harm has been going through the roof. It has been for a period of time. This confinement, people being confined into their homes, is only going to make this worse. And what we need is urgent support for people, and that support is available in patches, but it's not available in the way that it should have been available. And of course, austerity has, you know, made things profoundly more difficult for people. Suli, you mentioned Ramadan as well, and thank you for your question generally, but thank you for mentioning all the things you have. You know, after the Grenfell fire, which happened during Ramadan 3 years ago, I spent quite a bit of time working with women from marginalised communities, and there was one particular woman, it happens to be a Muslim woman who I worked with, and she told me that she was really, really reluctant to access mental health assistance. She was very reluctant to access counselling, trauma therapy. And when I said, well, you know, could you tell me why? And she said, well, yeah, she said, I want to find a counsellor of colour. I want to find someone who's from my own background who understands my realities, because I'm very scared that if I go to a counsellor and tell them that I'm having suicidal thoughts because I witnessed this inferno, that my children aren't sleeping, that I'm not coping, and if I go to that counsellor and say that the only way I'm coping is by further depending on my faith to get me through this, this woman was worried that she may be referred to the government's PREVENT programme, which is about counter-terrorism. Because this was a real devastation for me to hear this, because I thought, my goodness me, first of all, you've got women who have survived the inferno, who've lost friends in the inferno, and then they're busy policing themselves, as women do around the world, but they're having to filter what they're saying or what they're thinking and able to access help because they know that the state has a particular view of them in relation to the securitization agenda. So I found this really shocking. But last week I was contacted by another woman who happens to be a woman of colour. She has a large disposable income. She's got a good salary. She's got a good life. She said to me, please, can you help me? I need to find a counsellor. I'm not coping with what's going on. And I want to find a counsellor who is a woman of colour, who will understand and who will understand the trauma that I'm facing, the additional levels of racism that I'm facing, the additional levels of oppression that I'm facing because of my identity. And when I went out to go and try and find someone who could help her, I was connected to lots of different women, and they all said to me that counselling is one of the most kind of least representative areas of work in the NHS and outside of the NHS when it comes to mental health. So I just think that there's so much that needs to be tackled in relation to this. But I think it's really important that we keep talking about mental health. Mental health has been a taboo issue for too long, particularly amongst marginalised communities, marginalised women, and I've given some of the reasons for why, but we need to keep centering mental health in the holistic approach that is very much needed to ensure that people are given a chance to recover from COVID-19. It's going to take decades, right? But people have to be given an opportunity because that is their human right, and they should be absolutely given their human right.
Thank you. That's very, very insightful, very interesting to hear.
Thank you for your question, Suli. We have another question from the audience from Luke.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for an extremely enlightening and at points necessarily harrowing panel discussion. My question relates to masculinity, and would you agree that the concept and cultures of masculinity play like a role in gender violence, and in what ways? And is there a danger that the extremely masculinized images that are promoted by the new authoritarian strongmen, I mean, there are obvious examples here, particularly Bolsonaro as one of the most outlandish examples, that has this very negative effect on politics in general, but as potentially furthering the normalization, or even in some cases, maybe in Bolsonaro's case, the almost celebration of patriarchy and gender-based violence.
Thank you so much for that poignant question. Laura, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it seems very clear that masculinity, many forms of masculinity, most forms of masculinity are designed to generate violence and misogyny, and at the very least lack of respect to women. And that's not the same as saying all men are inherently violent, but I think we have to really, I mean, actually, I feel like recently I've really been having to come to terms with this kind of level of misogyny that is endemic within our society, as opposed to just thinking about individual people I know. And that came up for me very strongly during the general election. And so yes, in speaking to what you're saying about the rise of right-wing populism, I think we need to think harder and talk more about how toxic masculinity is absolutely at the centre of right-wing populism and nationalism. And you can also flip that around to say that maybe the left is not done a good enough job at, well, let me rephrase this. I feel that a lot of otherwise very good anti-austerity, pro-worker, left-wing ideas and discourse has inadvertently also been a very offered very masculine images of who is the working class, who's authentic, who are the real people. I think, and so today, this has been exciting today to have a really textured, detailed conversation about, you know, a much more diverse working class that is out there, that is experiencing very extreme effects of the pandemic, but which is also organising against against these effects. You know, the working class also has some women in it. It's not just white. And so I'm kind of taking Luke's question and taking it in a slightly different direction. But yes, I think that we probably on the left need to get better at thinking through the very kind of limited, narrow, and often quite violent models of masculinity that we have on offer, and creating new models of masculinity, and doing that not just in terms of how we critique the right, but also in terms of how we develop our own movement.
Thank you. Hera, do you have anything to say?
Yeah, I think I've over the past year realized that I've been living in an echo chamber of like a very progressive, like, you know, movements, and I've realigned myself to a place where I want to talk about these issues in a way that no matter where they are on the political spectrum, they understand the damages that, you know, things like toxic masculinity, white supremacy, casteism, and like how it affects people. So I've used the toxic masculinity like frame a lot, and I found that it really resonates on both, like all political leanings, if you can highlight how it really impacts, and unfortunately we have to, impacts men, and like how that actually creates like a society where, you know, you can talk about principles and those. Like for me, when I'm talking to people who are on the other side of the political lens for me, I often talk about how the pressure we put on young men and boys to be the protectors of women, to be the ones, you know, uphold their honor, to be the providers, and all of those things, you know, create these conditions where men feel entitled, like, and, you know, to be that person, and also really genders the debate, so it doesn't leave any space for people who don't fit that gender norm. So as Laura was saying, we can think of systems as that as well. Those often it's really hard to make like have that political discussion with someone who's like isn't really thinking about political system, is just thinking about like their everyday thing. So I do use that frame a lot, Luke, and I tend to sort of go down the boys route because I feel like, and so it feels so bad to say this, but as a feminist, but a lot of people care more about that narrative than they care about listening to how it affects young girls, because they've heard about it all. So rather than talking about child brides, I tend to think about like, well, what about, you know, the young like men as well, and how it affects them. And it's sad that I have to do this, but I've found that it's been a very effective tool in making people understand how this is everybody's problem and not just about elevating young girls, because a lot of people think right now that it's a world run by women, and it's obviously not. But something about our feminist chants have somehow worked, and it's, you know, fooled them into thinking that, but it hasn't really worked, because the world we live in is still misogynistic and we are suffering every day. So I've been reframing things.
Thank you so much for that. I don't think we have any questions from the audience. So one thing I would like to end on that I think might be nice is in the work that each of you are doing, Hera, you already mentioned this, but I'd like to just circle back so we can finish on this. What is giving you hope right now? Let's start with Shaista.
Yeah, so believe it or not, I'm a very hopeful person. I'm an internal optimist. I'm a realist, but I'm an optimist as well. And I like to identify the problems and then to work on what we're going to do about them. And so what's giving me hope, first of all, is that so many people are refusing to be silenced despite the level of violence and abuse they face, the fear that they have. They still refuse to be silenced, and I think that is incredible. And this very much gives me hope. I think also the fact that we're questioning things in the way that we are, so many of us. If you look at some, people go around, people criticize Twitter and other spaces, and we know these are very small spaces, by the way, and they're kind of only open to certain people. But I think if we look at the different kind of discourse that is emerging from there, the different type of writers that are coming through, people, the creative, the creative sector, the kind of things that we're seeing, it's showing us that these voices and these realities are coming through. But also, just the fact that, men are also questioning masculinity as well. I mean, Luke, your question was excellent. This gives me hope as well. Masculinity is a construct of patriarchy. All of our oppressions are interlinked. And I think some of us are starting to realize that. When I look at the women's rights movement in Mexico, for example, I feel great hope. I find that, I'm learning so much from activists over there. And I wish we could apply some of it to our activism over here. And I think there's just a lot of hope. I think there's, people, what we're facing is unprecedented in terms of a person's lifetime, and not only are people having to manage their own trauma, their own grief, their own fears, then some people are also looking to build that solidarity. They're looking to come together, and I think that's really, really powerful and really hopeful. And I do feel that change will come from us, not from the politicians, not from the political system. They will have to catch up with us. So that's what I find hopeful. I find the building of solidarity and the desire to keep going really, really powerful.
Thank you so much. Laura, do you want to share something?
I guess my hope comes from the fact that I think this is an exceptional historical moment that has disrupted everybody's lives, even if it's disrupted them in very different ways. And I just hope that we can use this as a moment to, capitalism has in some weird way ground to a halt, hasn't it? And so is this a moment to say, well, there might be other ways of living and there might be other ways of organizing society, and whether that simply consists of saying, you know what, we don't all need to come into work and stand around for 8-9 hours every day. Actually, we can just get our work done in 3 hours and then do something nice. Or whether that consists of, so many people have said this, suddenly getting to know their neighbours, or everybody, actually, I think the mutual aid groups, the knowledge of how fast all those mutual aid groups seems to just emerge almost from nowhere, obviously driven by people with very thoughtful political ideas, but at the same time, everybody kind of thought the same thing at the same moment and joined mutual aid groups and is looking after each other and are looking after total strangers, not just their little nuclear family, but total strangers. I was just like, wow, human beings are incredible. Like we do know how to run our society in an equal way. We do know how to share things. We do know how to look out for people. And, I really want this government to fall really damn quickly. I don't think we're in an easy situation, but it did make clear to me that, there are always cracks. There's always possibilities for new things to grow out of them. And so I guess amidst all of the kind of horror that we've been talking about today and many of us are experiencing, I also think this genuinely could be a moment from which something quite fundamentally, radically new could grow.
Beautiful, thank you. Hera?
Yes, so like Shaista, I'm also a very optimistic person. I have the good fortune of working with volunteers on CHAYN, so we're working 20-30 hours a week on top of their day job. So I'm always in a state of optimism because I'm doing something about it. And I think in general, I think we criticize the government quite a lot, rightly so. It is our job to keep them accountable, and they are accountable. But I've felt over the last few weeks that there have been real glimmers of hope, that they are listening and responding, and that there are certain things that they're willing to engage on, and that the model for governance around the world is shifted from being like just voter based to actually now thinking about participatory, like public policy making. The fact that we have gender mainstreaming, we're talking about feminist like politics and feminist principles. There are feminist tech initiatives. When I started CHAYN, it was a very, very tiny space. And I just loved getting contacted by young feminists, like creating spaces of their own. We obviously, an amazing women's movement that has moved us forward. But I also think it's time for the like young feminists to stand up, and they're kind of taking control and reforming things. And that's just, it's just so inspiring. For me, I definitely see like there's so much anxiety and trauma around the work that I do, but like for me, I see more hope than I see the trauma, because I know that people really care, and they're, you know, turning up to events like this, thinking about like what gender lens is, you know, who thought this would be something that we would be talking about like 20 years ago. So we've made a huge headway, and I think we have a long way to go. And I just don't, I feel like there's lots of opportunities for us collectively to work on the great reset after the lockdowns end, and use this as a wake-up call.
Thank you so much. It's been such a privilege to be part of this conversation and to learn from each of you. I hope the audience comes away with this having learned more about the feminist and gendered aspects of coronavirus and its victims, but also where we can find hope and space for organizing and formulating a different way forward. Thank you all so much for joining us. Stay healthy and safe.